Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Moffett-Bateau, better known as Professor MB. Sorry, I got a crick in my neck there. And in this video, I want to talk to you guys about how to more effectively take notes when you're doing your writing or your reading, right? Particularly when you're writing or reading academic work. I remember when I was in graduate school and I was studying for my qualifying exams, right? And your qualifying exams are what certify you as an expertise in your field. So I had a reading list of 100+ books in American politics that I had to read and write detailed notes for over the course of 3 to 4 months. And in full transparency, I failed the first time, right? The first time I took my comprehensive exams did not go well. And a big part of that was because I didn't really understand how to be efficient in my academic note taking, right? Like I was doing what most students do, which is just highlighting and noting everything that I thought was of interest to me. And that's because I didn't understand that academic work in particular always follows a very particular structure. And that's important because when you're taking comprehensive exams or when you're writing a paper or when you're putting together a syllabus for a course, everyone who's engaging with the materials that you create are going to be looking for your understanding of the central arguments that came up in the papers and books that you read, the data that they presented, and their core findings, right? And maybe the theoretical framework, depending on, whether we're talking about people who care about theory. So after I failed this exam, I was like, nope, it's not going to be me. I'm never failing again. And so I went to every American politics professor in my department and showed them my exam and said, can you tell me why you failed me? Right. Brutal experience, but life changing. Right. Because as with most systems, there's all this informal information dissemination happening that I wasn't privy to as one of the few Black students in my program. So I won't bore you all with all of the details, but one particularly racist professor, right, um, pointed out this problem with my note taking. And he said, when I was in graduate school, we had to write 1-page summaries of everything we read. And that's all we had space for. We were not allowed to go over a page. And he showed me the framework that they used back in his day to write formal notes. Now, since then, I've added my own sections, and my notes are almost always 2 or 3 pages long. 1 page was not going to happen. But this was life changing because it taught me that there were certain sections of everything I was reading that I needed to pay more attention to than others. So now going forward, when I skimmed, I knew what to skim, right? I read the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion of any academic book and the academic article. And then if I find that I don't understand the key arguments, then I'll go back and read in the middle according to the section that's most relevant to what I don't understand. Sometimes I will read the whole article from front to back if it's an article that is in particular interest to me, maybe it's closely related to something I'm studying or something that I'm writing about or something that I'm teaching about. But in general, especially with academic books, if you read the introduction and the conclusion, you have the gist of it, right? And you only need to go into more detail if you're particularly interested in their theoretical framework or the case study they use or what have you, right? And so that experience was really important to me because as I found out, sometimes being successful in predominantly white institutions means that really racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic people are the ones holding the information that you need. And if you decide that you're going to stay in those kind of institutions, then you have to figure out how to manage the reality that, um, someone who you would probably not deal with in real life is someone that you need to engage with for the sake of your career. And it turns out this one pager not only helped me pass my American politics exam, but I passed my political theory exam shortly thereafter. And I have long since stopped dealing with that other professor, but I still use this note sheet. And that's what I'm going to show you guys today, right? I remember going to so many professors and saying, how do you write notes? How do I know what to write down? And literally, folks were dumbfounded. They had no idea how to teach note taking. It was just something that they considered very personal, right? Like a lot of professors were like, I just write notes in the margins. So my hope is that this video is not only going to be helpful to my students in my courses, so that y'all will start writing more effective notes that will help you in your quizzes and your tests and the papers to come. But I'm also hoping that this will be helpful to other folks out there too, whether that's faculty, junior faculty, postdocs, graduate students, what have you. So please let me know if this information ends up being helpful to you or if there are questions, things I could have clarified better. And, if there's other subjects that you'd like for me to talk about in my videos, leave some ideas down below. All right, so let's get started with my note-taking framework. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then y'all will be able to see what I have in front of me. Okay. So this is the academic note outline that I use for literally everything, right? And these, I would argue, are the most important sections that you need to understand from any piece of academic work that you're reading, at least in the social sciences, right? I can't speak to what the life sciences or the policy or what the humanities folks do. Although my sense is that public policy also follows a similar kind of framework. So anytime you are reading something, right, even if you're just casually skimming it, it is in your best interest to at least write up a brief summary of it. I'm of the mind that your notes should be as detailed as the utility of what you're reading. So if you know that this is going to be covered in an exam, or you're going to write about it in a book, you want to write more detailed notes, right? But if you're just skimming through a bunch of stuff, trying to figure out what you're going to be reading for your project, right? Then you can write, kind of a brief summation simply from the abstract and the introduction, And that way, you know, if you need to come back to it later. Okay. So obviously the title, the authors, the publication year, way more important than you would think. I also might put the publisher or the journal. Again, especially if you're writing a dissertation project or a book project, citation management makes such a big difference at the end. And so you need to plan for that early. More information that you write down and the more organized it is, it will help you for the rest of your life. I mean, if I had a good access to my political theory notes, I have way better access to my American politics notes, and I reference those boys all the time. Right? Because there's no reason that you need to keep rereading the same things over and over and over again if you write solid enough notes. So the research question is a big one, and yet you will find that there is a tremendous amount of academic work out in the world that doesn't have a clearly stated research question, right? So, like this article that we're going to be kind of going through as our case, as our example today, mapping the margins. This is a classic canonical Black feminist but also a critical race theory article by Kimberly Crenshaw, published in 1991 on intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw is considered one of the foremothers of intersectionality. She didn't actually come up with the idea, but she did frame our larger understanding of it in a way that's been really important for Black feminism, right? But in this piece, right, it's a law review article. And so it doesn't clearly have a research question, right? And so you also need to understand the type of work that you're reading, right? Because more theoretical work, work that is developing an idea, right? So another good one, another good example of this is Kathy Cohen's article on deviance, right? Or her work on moral panic and queerness, right? These articles don't clearly have, as such, a research question. And so sometimes, as you'll find in my notes that I'm going to show you guys in a bit for the Kimberly Crenshaw place, I just deleted that section, right? Because try as I may, I wasn't able to find a research question, but it does have a central argument. Every single academic article that you are going to read will always have a central argument. If you can't figure out what it is, it's probably not you. It's probably terrible academic writing, but nevertheless, it's on you to figure out what the argument is. And if you can't figure out what the argument is, that's when you go and make an appointment for office hours. Or if you're already a faculty member or postdoc somewhere, this is when you call one of your friends or whomever recommended this, like, girl, what is the argument of this thing? Because I don't know what's going on. You know, prior studies can function in a number of different ways. Because I am an Americanist and a theorist and a Black feminist, I deal a lot in theoretical and some conceptual work. And prior studies is exactly what it says, right? It's a kind of a summation of, like, who are they citing as the work that they're building upon, or who is the citations that they're presenting themselves, the writer, I mean, as in direct opposition to, right? So are they countering a particular narrative? In Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, she's countering white feminism, right? But I wasn't as interested in that, right? And so I'm actually, when I show you all my notes, you'll see that I'm actually citing how she traces out some of the genealogy of the ideas that she's interested in. And then the theoretical framework can also be tricky to identify, I think, especially if you're an undergraduate student, right? Because the thing about it is in academic articles and books, this it's not going to be clearly labeled like it is in your papers, right? It's not going to say, and my research question is, and my central argument is, and this is the prior study section, and this is a theoretical framework section. You have to read a lot so that you start to understand how to identify these things, right? Mapping the margins is about a theoretical framework called intersectionality, right? So in this section, I'm going to parse out what are the defining components of intersectionality according to Crenshaw in this piece, right? And then very, very importantly, you're going to know like what kind of data they collected, when did they collect it, that kind of thing. And then finally, you're going to note their big findings, right? What are the major conclusions? You should start with whatever they list in their abstract as their central finding, and then you can add on as necessary. And a lot of times when I'm doing my note taking, I will also add on a section called notes. Sometimes I'll add in a section called definitions, right? In my notes, it'll be just me kind of maybe there's direct quotes I find really helpful that I might want to use in my work. Maybe there are other details that aren't kind of strictly defined, but I find interesting for whatever reason. And then under definitions, if the work uses a lot of jargon or terminology that I'm not familiar with, or maybe I am looking for how they define certain terms, right? So right now I'm working on a book project about the need to redefine and reconceptualize politics and the political. And so I am particularly interested in how a number of different book projects and articles define words like politics, political, community, Black community, right? Because in our academic work, we're asked to define the key concepts that we use again and again in our work. So that's just something to have in the back of your mind. Like I say, I don't keep these two in the kind of formal academic note outline, mostly because like these categories is what was given to me way back in the day. And so I tend to just kind of leave a good thing alone. But I do shift it and add new things or take things out as the particular note set uh, requires. And I think that's one of the huge, huge lessons. My apologies. For some reason, my hay fever is being crazy. But I think this is one of the kind of key lessons here is although these are the kind of key components that when you're asked about a work, if you can answer these questions, people will assume that you've read the work, right? And that you know the work well. However, you also need to be flexible and malleable because not every academic work is the same. All right. So briefly then, I'm going to show y'all how I go about doing my note-taking process. So for work that I am totally unfamiliar with, I might just, like I said, read the introduction, read the conclusion, and kind of get my feet wet and grounded in what the author is trying to do, right? And this is a particularly long piece. And there's something about the font that makes it hard to see the section headings. but this is where the conclusion starts, right? So I'm going to read this conclusion after I read the introduction to try and get a sense of what she's doing here, right? And so just from doing that, I know that she is using violence against Black women as an example through which to illustrate what intersectionality means and how it can work as a theoretical framework in an academic context, but also how, as an academic concept, it has really important policy implications as well, right? So, given that, intersectionality is really important to me, as is Black feminism, I already knew from the get that I was going to read this whole thing, right? And so I go through and I outline, right, the title, the author, the publication year, and now I'm on the hunt, right? I'm not simply reading, right? I am actively going through this work to try and see, how do I find these sections, right? I'm neurodivergent and have ADHD. And so I need to make things a game so that I will stay engaged. And so I always think about this as like a treasure hunt, and I'm trying to find the different pieces, right? So you can also try to use resources that are going to help you, right? So little things that people tend to ignore, like what PDF viewer you use, actually makes a huge difference in terms of what you can do with the PDF and how you can engage with it. I cannot tell you how many reviews I read of different PDF viewers before I landed on PDF Expert. It is totally worth the cost, and I'm so happy with it, right? So, you can do different, there's an annotation section, an edit section where I can actually like write in text, right? So as I am kind of scrolling through here, looking for the central argument, right? I see that here she is making a key point about intersectionality. So I'm just going to write that down so that I know where to find it later, right? And I'm going to try to, size it to the best of my ability. I don't have a lot of space here. But the other thing that I can do, and this is what I'm more likely to do, is I'm also going to look through my annotation options, right? And what I really like about PDF Expert is that you don't have to hold your hand in a straight line to get straight highlights. And so I can just click this here and I will highlight the whole thing, right? And it lets you highlight in sections in terms of what is most necessary, right? And so this allows me to be able to come back to these sections really easily. And if you want to get really fancy with it, you could even do different color highlights, right? But now that I understand what she's trying to do in this section, right? Now I can go to my central argument, right? And what I actually do here is I make sure I click off of the annotation first, and then I can actually highlight this, right? And actually cut and paste it into my document here. Now, this is an old PDF. So as you can see, there are bits and pieces that are left out, but I would much rather have to fix this than trying to type out this whole thing, right? And so eventually, this raggedy looking piece here will become this section, right? And this is the first part of the argument that she's trying to make, right? The second part of the argument that she's trying to make is here, right? And so I made sure that I wrote the entire quote, right? But for some folks, they may not want to work that way, right? You'll see that the way I work is by just writing out the entire quote of what she said. And sometimes I will paraphrase and or summarize in my own language. But 9 times out of 10, I'm doing a direct quote because I want to be able to come back to this and see exactly what language they used. And then I will summarize or paraphrase when I'm writing my own work. But here I do block quotes. You do not have to do the same thing, right? Once you got a sense of the central argument are kind of articulated in these two different paragraphs, you could absolutely sum it up in one sentence. And in fact, if you are planning on writing a book or you're going to have to write about this in exam, that's probably your best bet, right? I think it has everything to do with how you plan to use these notes going forward, right? When I write a note on an article, I want to make sure that if I come back to it 15 or 20 years later, which I literally have done, and I can see clearly what the author was trying to do, not my understanding at the time of what the author was trying to do. And hopefully that makes sense. So the other thing is, though, is that you want to pay attention to what the author is doing with their writing. As you can see, Kimberly Crenshaw loved her some footnotes, right? Like literally, there are entire pages of footnotes. So that's a signal that you're going to want to pay attention to the footnotes or the endnotes or whatever it may be, right? Because there's a lot of information in here. And so on page 1244, she actually articulates the theoretical framework that she's building upon, right? And this is a Black feminist theoretical framework. And so I make sure in my section on prior studies that I note that what she's doing in terms of building her theory is working from a Black feminist perspective. And I, again, write the full quote so that I fully understand what that means. And then as I go through the rest of the article, right, because I'm paying attention, I'm highlighting, I'm going back and forth, right? What I realize is that I may have missed things in other sections. So I am always going back and forth, right? So I get to 1245 and realize, oh, okay, she's doing a lot of work here about defining intersectionality. So let me go back and make sure there aren't any pieces that I've missed, right? So yes, I write another notation from the footnotes on that comes up in 1245, 1244, and 1245. But I also am writing some of the pieces that I highlighted here. And then I'm going back and now that I have a better understanding of what she's trying to do, I actually will go back and make sure that I fully understood those first couple of pages, right? Because the first 4 or 5 pages of any academic article is where you should have received the argument, the question, and the theoretical framework, right? On 1245, she also, in the footnotes, goes in depth about her research, right? And what she actually did. which is unusual. But this is why you have to pay attention. This is why I say that every academic article isn't the same. So I highlight this to draw attention to it, and then I make sure I note it in my data section, right? So as you can see, I'm at 1246, and I've already covered the central argument, the prior studies, the theoretical framework, and the data, right? So at that point, I'm going to go back to the conclusion and see if there's anything else that I missed in terms of the theory that she's building or the argument that she's building. And when I realize there's not, I'm scanning through this again, and I realize that these next couple of sections, this one on structural intersectionality, this section on political intersectionality, this section on domestic violence and anti-racist politics. These are case studies through which she is demonstrating how intersectionality works, right? Meaning she is using, for example, how domestic violence was politicized in the 80s to show how intersectionality works in the lives of Black women, right? And so, again, if I am writing an exam or preparing for an exam, I could actually create another section here called case studies, right? And, structural intersectionality, political intersectionality, social intersectionality. And then from within there, I could create, um, subheadings and to fully articulate what they were, right? And so the paragraphs under each of these sections could be as detailed or as brief as I want them to, right? So in this section under structural intersectionality and immigration intersectionality, Crenshaw reviews how uh, undocumented women end up hyper vulnerable to the state and to domestic abusers who take advantage of their undocumented legal status, right? And I could, again, go into more detail about that. I could leave it out. It really just depends on what you're trying to do with your notes, right? And you could literally do 1 to 2 line summaries of each of these case studies if you wanted to. You could do a paragraph of each if you wanted to, right? It really is about what will jog your memory. Are you looking at your notes as a map with little signals to yourself that you will return to, right? So I may write this note on race and domestic violence, right? Race and the domestic, sorry, my typing is terrible. But I'm also going to write down the page number, right? Because if I understand my notes as a map that I am trying to follow back when I'm writing or taking an exam, right? Then I want to make sure that I have the directions, meaning the page numbers, right? But even here, I should be writing the page number at every step, right? But you could also look at these one pagers, so to speak, as a freestanding document in and of itself that ensures you don't have to go back and look at the article again if you know you write really good and accurate notes, right? Neither way is better than the other, but you just need to be clear about what your note-taking philosophy is, right? Is it a map or is it a freestanding document? Either way, every single thing you put on here has to have a page number attached to it because you don't want to be caught out here plagiarizing, right? We want to give people credit for their work. And so that means that every single idea, you want to make sure that you're writing a page number to it, right? So you can credit the person later if you use the idea. So this has gone a little bit longer than I intended, but before I close out, I want to show you how I keep track of my notes, because I think this is one of the things that students struggle with the most, right? Is, okay, I'm going to take all of these notes, but what do I do with them, right? I am very over the top about the organization of my file folders. I always have been, but I know I am mostly alone in that. But even if you are especially particular in the ways that I am about your note taking and your file organizing, for whatever reason, it's just really easy for those notes, those Word documents to get lost to time, right? Because once a semester is over, I don't look at the fall 2022 folder ever again, really, unless I'm looking for something specific, which is why I really prefer to have a note-taking system, like a dedicated system for notes. And that's what I use Evernote for, right? I use Evernote to take notes about everything. It has really replaced the moleskin I used to always have in my bag. And it's not because I have treated my notebook addiction, not at all. It's that, similar to the folders on my computer, I don't really go back and review old notebooks. So I needed something that I could search, something that I could work within, that I could write notes about doctor's appointments, about conferences, about meetings with advisors, 10-year meetings, all of it, right? But relevant to this conversation, I have a whole notebook on academic books and articles, right? And, I have 144 of these notes, and they all follow that same framework, right? So if you go to my homepage, you'll see that like the one pin note I have, as well as a shortcut, is the academic books outline, because I am always just copying and pasting, going to my academic book section and, writing a new set of notes when every time I read something, like I told you guys, at the very least, I am putting the title, the author, the publication year, and so on, right? And if I'm really about my business, right, I will also attach the PDF of the actual book or article that I was reading so that I can always have it, right? And so that those two things are always together. Remember, I also said you need a citation management system. I use Mendeley, but with Mendeley, you can also attach the PDFs to each citation, and I like having that as a kind of fail safe in case something happens, right? So everything that I do, whenever I put it in Evernote, I put in the title, right? And I also put the publication year, right? So that I always know, so I can like see it from afar when I am kind of scrolling down here, because you'll see in these notes, it's way easier to see the titles than it is to see, what's happening here, right? But, I will attach each article to this. Uh, and that inch, and see, I'm over here telling y'all how to do things. And because I haven't done this in a while, I have forgotten how to attach a document. That is terrible. Clearly, the button was right here. So, I go through and I add it at the bottom, right? And so now it's always there. And what's really nice about Evernote is that you can actually flip through the pages without having to open it fully. And my notes from PDF Expert show up in here too, right? And so you really, if you can, the point is that you really want to keep all of your notes together in a easily searchable system. The great thing about Evernote is that it not only searches every note that you put in here, but it also searches the PDFs. So if intersectionality comes up in any PDF or any note, it's going to show it, right? And so it highlights every single time I've used the word intersectionality, but see, it's also showing intersectionality, when it shows up in this actual document, right? And then it continues here and in the other things that I have written notes about or ideas about. And I have a notebook for everything that I'm writing. I mean, look, here's the dissertation section from way back in the day, right? um here are academic projects that I'm working on. Every time I have an idea, I have an idea notebook in here. This is a website that I wanted to build. These are articles that I'm working on, right? Each one has their different notebook. And then I'm able to put those notebooks under these big sections like research and writing, side hustle, teaching, online teaching, the whole nine, right? So I hope that this was helpful to y'all. My goal really was just to make sure that um, you have a strong understanding of how to write notes so that you are not feeling lost when you are assigned a lot of reading, but that you're also not feeling lost if you're trying to enter the academy and there's some things you should be trying to grasp from your reading, but for whatever reason, you just can't kind of grab on hold to it. I totally understand that. That was me for way longer than I'd love to admit. And so I hope that this resource is helpful to y'all. So enjoy your afternoon, your morning, or your night. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed our talk about academic notes. It's not the most exciting subject in the world, but I know for me, it's been really helpful. All right, bye.